Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Accessibility, 4 Tricks You Can Do Right Now, brought to you by Plutora. I would like to introduce you to our presenters. First, Dylan Barrell. Dylan is the Chief Product Officer at Deque. He has almost 20 years of experience in technology development, technical sales, product management, product marketing, and corporate development. Dylan founded a startup in 1989 that was acquired. He then went public with OpenText and helped grow revenues to over $400 million. He later led the effort to create a digital center within a border store and to begin the transition from purely physical products to digital and physical product mix delivered in a cross-channel online and in-store way. Secondly, we have Jeff Keyes, the Director and Product Marketing at Plutora. Jeff got his first programming job at the age of 16 and has spent his career writing code, designing software features and UI, running dev and test teams, consulting and driving product and strategy and messaging. Outside of 6 years at Microsoft, he's been primarily focused on growing startup companies.
Sweet. You're here because you're interested in accessibility, and I'm really excited about this topic. I'm just going to dive right in because, well, I am a marketing guy now. I love working with Dylan because he's got a lot of really good experience in this process of accessibility, a lot of history, and that's why I like this topic, because when you get somebody that's really smart, like Dylan, glad to have you, you get to do some really cool things. So I know when you think about doing accessibility as part of your pipelines, it seems really hard. And if you've ever seen that documentary on Free Solo, it's like you can look at the side of El Capitan and wonder how the crap can you get there, and it's really daunting. And I think many organizations feel this way about implementing the changes necessary to produce software, because it ain't easy. And Dylan, I'm sure that's probably where you come in and say, well, you see this all the time, right?
Yeah. I think it's a lot like looking at somebody who's really good at something that you have no idea about, and wondering how do they do that. If you could move to the next slide, Jeff, I think this is the key. The key is 2 things. First of all, accessibility is about change. It's about learning new skills. People in your organization have to learn to do things that they haven't had to do in the past, and it's about learning to not do things that you've done in the past that go against accessibility. And so the second aspect of that is that it's not a one-time thing. It's not a project. It's a forever thing. You have to make accessibility part of your development process, and that requires a lot of process change and change in the organization, change in the things that management expects from the development organization. And as a result, like with most change, everybody wants to see it happen, but when it comes down to doing it, very few people are willing to change on their own without some kind of incentive. So I think one of the key things about doing accessibility and not being daunted by it is just realizing that, like any other skill that you want to learn, you have to. It's going to take you some time to get there, and you have to have a program that's going to manage that change in order to get yourself there.
That's right. And trying to get them there, I think that whole thing is the challenge of, okay, well, how do you do it? how do you get started?
Well, I think that the key is to once again, just if you could go to the next slide, you'll see this smiling picture of a guy who's obviously better than I am at climbing mountains, and he has all the right tools strapped to him, to his chest, or at least some of them, and hopefully he has all the right skills to be able to use them. So I think the best place to start is in helping your organization to acquire that, and setting some small goals in place that can help them get there. I'm really interested, Jeff, in the attendees in finding out where various different people are in the accessibility process. So maybe we could put up the poll and see what our attendees say in terms of where they are today with accessibility.
I think that's a great idea. Do you want to go ahead and push that poll now? Oh, I think it's open.
The poll has been launched.
Excellent. You know, it kind of reminds me of the C.S. Lewis quote, "It may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird, but it would be a lot harder for a bird to learn to fly while remaining an egg." You know, wherever we're at, we have to recognize we just need to take the next step. And from there, we can then take the next step. So, you know, finding those places where we can start is pretty key. And if you look at this poll, you know, curious about where you're interested and where you see yourself right now.
We're going to give it about 30 more seconds. Less than a third of you have voted, so please keep voting. And we'll share those results shortly.
Awesome. Cool.
Okay, let's take a look. Are you able to see these results, Jeff, or would you like me to read them aloud?
I am not able to see the results.
Yes,
I am. I can see them.
Yeah.
Yes. So in accessibility, it sounds like 20% are no plans or really just starting to learn about it. 40%, the majority, are, you know, just planning to start implementing the next year, basically. And so what it tells me is you're just looking for the right places to start. And another 20% have implemented on some pipelines and are expanding. And there's another 20% that have implemented on most pipelines in the portfolio and are just looking for ways to mature it to the next level. So across the board, but it looks like the majority of folks are just starting and learning, which is why you're here. So, you know, I guess with that, it's like drawing the analogy, Dylan, like, okay, so let's get in and see, you know, how do we get started?
Yeah, well, a lot of this has to do, a lot of accessibility has to do with communication. It's about communicating the information in the user interface or your application to the users, and it's also about communicating the intent of the design into the implementation of that design in a way that achieves what the application designer intended to achieve. So accessibility is a lot about communication, a lot about taking things that are in people's heads and making sure that they make it all the way to the dev team and then ultimately to the end user. So talking about ways we can start, one of the things we can start is just by understanding, well, what are the sorts of information that need to be conveyed along that chain, all the way from, if you really want to start with it, all the way from the business needs through the designer, all the way to the end user through the development team, and really understanding what pieces of that need to be conveyed within the dev team, starting within the dev team, so that the QA and the developers can actually implement and test that the way that it was designed and intended.
Gotcha. So the real key is getting this meaning that's coming from, you know, from the design intent of here's this intent of what we're trying to do, and getting that communicated in a fashion that everybody can understand it all the way through, including development and testing.
Yeah, and as we'll see later on, when we start talking about accessibility, automated accessibility testing, you'll see that you know, meaning, where meaning comes from in application development is it comes from the design. Most people starting out with accessibility understand pretty quickly the concept of, well, if I've got an image, then I need a text description of that image, and that's supposed to convey the meaning of the image and the context of the application. Well, where do you find the meaning of all the rest of the interface controls? In particular, if you have interface controls that maybe don't have words on them to describe what their function is. Maybe they use icons, you know, and other sorts of designs, control designs, to convey the intent and the meaning to people who can see that.
Right.
So where that design intent comes from where that meaning comes from is from the design intent. As the designer, the business analyst and designer decided what to do, what were they trying to achieve?
Well, let's get into that. So give me an example of that meaning and design intent. What does that actually, what's that look like in practice?
So what it ends up looking like, let's talk about, I'm going to show the attendees here one way to achieve this within a development team. Now, a lot of different development teams, especially in Agile, have different ways that they communicate between the team members. Some of them are more formal and have a lot more documentation. Others have a lot less documentation and use whiteboards and other forms of communication. So it's not really about the medium of the communication as much as it is about the content of that communication and the fact that that communication takes place. So what I've got here, if you're looking at this slide for the first time, kind of busy, right? A lot of information on it. And actually, if you look in the middle of this, the left half of that screen is a very small toolbar with 3 buttons on it. And you would think if you just looked at that toolbar, well, there's not a lot of design intent you need to communicate about that toolbar, but in fact there is. And this information that's laid out around it over here shows you how much there is. There are things that we call the widget annotations, and those are things like what is the role, the name, and the state of each of the different elements of this particular widget. So obviously the toolbar itself, its role is a toolbar, and within it, it has, in this case, 3 different buttons, each of whose role is button. Now the button with the little arrow that's pointing to the left and the vertical bar obviously has a meaning, and that meaning in this case is previous track. Now that's very relevant because when the designer communicates that explicitly to the development team, the developer can then utilize that as the alternative text or accessible name for that button. But the QA person can also pick that piece of information up and validate that now. So now what you've done is you've taken something that very often just gets forgotten and assumed, and therefore and often then doesn't happen, or the developer makes something up themselves and the QA people don't test it at all, and so it just kind of falls into the cracks. So it's a very simple thing for a designer to say, my intent of what this button's name should be is previous track. And the same thing for the button in the middle, which is obviously pause play button. It will have a different name depending on the state that it's in, whether it's playing or it's paused. And then the next track button, the same thing. And then the state comes into play. That as you can see, if you're able to see this, one of those buttons has a darker background than the others. What does that mean? What is the meaning of that darker background? In this case, it means that the button's disabled because obviously if you're on the first track of some kind of a collection of audio, then there is no previous track. Or in this particular instance, they've decided there is no previous track. And so disabling that button, you need to convey that somehow to sighted users. It's done with a different color background. And then that state obviously needs to be conveyed also to screen reader users so that can be read out. And then, of course, the focus state at the bottom with the lighter background. So what happens, so I can see if I'm a keyboard user where I am as I interact with these buttons. I need to be able to see which button I'm on. So there's obviously that focus state as well. So this gives you an idea of that, the meaning associated with some of these controls.
And that's really cool too. I would imagine you start building up libraries of common controls that you use across your application at that point, so you can consolidate some of the design intent communication.
Yeah, not only that, but you start when you start formalizing some of these things. When you design the first couple of controls, you have a lot of information, and then you can start developing a shorthand for those things. So what we have, and in fact this is publicly available, is we have our pattern library called Cauldron, and we share it on GitHub. And if you search for DQ pattern library, you can actually go to the website where you can play around with the components. But when we're designing a new user interface or a new piece of user interface using that, we don't put for every button, this is a button, he has all the different states. We say, use default button number 1. And then everything else about that is defined in that pattern library. So the developer and the tester can just go and pick that up. And in a lot of cases, we have tests created for that. They can just reuse to make sure that the buttons in their implementation don't break. So yeah, as you do more and more of this and you share more of this between your teams, it becomes a lot quicker, and the teams can develop a shorthand. And in fact, on some of the next couple of slides, you'll see some of the shorthand that our teams internally have developed, specifically around things like focus management.
Sure. Well, and what we talked about here, what was the design intent of the meaning of what I'm seeing? But I guess we're going to talk probably next about, well, tell me what that looks like from an interaction point of view and what I'm supposed to be able to do with it.
Yeah, so the next thing is, and I apologize, I have an extra one sitting there that didn't get removed in the build. But the other thing that's obviously very important is, not everybody can see, not everybody can use a mouse for various different reasons. So you need to design what the interaction will be for different modes and different device types, like a keyboard or a single switch and those sorts of things. So whereas the interaction at the top here, which is talking about how you interact with it using touch, is pretty straightforward. We need to define what happens when we tab into this thing and focus moves into the toolbar. How does focus move from one toolbar button to the next, and how do we interact with the individual buttons? Now, most cases you'll say you'll just use a normal regular button and you don't have to define that. But if you're designing some new type of control or something that's relatively unique, then you definitely need to go into a lot of detail as to how a keyboard, for example, and any other types of devices will interact with that particular component. So here we can see what happens when we say when on first track, disable previous track, when on last track, disable next track, when playing, display the pause button, all that sort of stuff. And at the top we see space or enter equals click. Disable buttons cannot receive focus, and that sort of detail. There's additional information we would add that's not on this particular markup about how you get from button to button, etc.
Gotcha. Very cool. And so kind of moving this along with the next step, what other concerns would you have as a designer then as you look at a collection of these things? What kinds of things are important as you start to look at these things from a more holistic view?
Yeah, so if we, obviously that was a very small little toolbar component. We could have even taken it smaller and gone down to individual button basis, but then obviously user interfaces are made up of multiple of these. So some of the concerns that you have when you're talking about combining multiple components into a more complex user interface is things like, what is the order in which a user should interact with the interactive component? So what you can see on the screen here is a focus order markup showing that as the user tabs through this user interface, it's the web user interface in this case, what order, what are the focusable things that they get to? So the first thing they'll get to, for those of you who are familiar with our Axe browser extension for accessibility testing, you'll recognize this UI. The first thing that it focuses on is the version of the Axe core library. The second thing it focuses on is the little drop down for the URL/scope. The third thing it goes to is the actual the link to the upgrade to Axe Pro, to the Pro version of our product, etc., etc. So this is telling both the developer and the tester what order these things should appear in, so that can be implemented and can be tested as well. Now, obviously, you want to match the keyboard order with the order that you'd expect a sighted user using a mouse or somebody using a touch device to interact with it. The idea is that you keep those two in sync as a best practice as well. And if you go to the next slide, Jeff, we can talk also about the reading order. And reading order is related to focus order, but it doesn't always have to be the same. It's definitely a best practice to keep the reading order the same as the focus order, because weird things can start to happen and you can actually break the meaning of your user interface if those two things get out of sync. So normally this looks very similar in terms of the order in which things get encountered, but every now and again you might have something which changes. You just have to be very careful about that reading order. And there are other concerns as well that you have when you're dealing with really large user interfaces, like How does a keyboard only user jump or navigate around parts of the page? How do they get to the main content? So
Sure.
things like skip links, things like landmark regions, and they can be used for navigation with a screen reader, become some of the concerns that you'll want to mark up as a designer, so that your developers don't have to guess the order in which the information and the grouping of the information that the users are expected to consume.
Yeah. And I still remember, okay, so I have to, sins of my past. It's funny that I still remember the very first time I ever just even tried to tab through one of my user interfaces and watching the focus bounce from top to bottom to left, all over the place, realizing I totally messed that up. And I can't imagine how hard it would be for someone who is required to use the keyboard, or, can't really see things, or using a screen reader to be able to get anything without having, these things thought about and verified in. It's a big deal. I also have another bet from my side is you can tell when a user interface has been thought through this way, because if you're thinking through these kinds of things, you're also thinking through the usability. The more that things are standardized, the better that they end up being from a usability point of view, because there's a design intent recognized, it's been communicated, and the patterns become common, and now people know what to expect, and you have a more usable product. I think all those are really good. But the challenge really that I ran into, Dylan, was, it's hard. In order to do that, this is a lot of work. It doesn't come easy, to go and do this every time I change anything. I mean, if I change one thing, how do I go do all this? It doesn't really fit into Agile super easily. And it seems like there's not. I mean, everything we just talked about feels like it's a really manual process, and doesn't seem like we have anything to do here to automate it.
Well, so the design is definitely manual for sure, and as I said, you don't always, if you're making a small change to one of those user interfaces, you obviously don't have to mark up the entire thing and communicate the entire thing. And teams develop a shorthand for some of the communicating some of that stuff very quickly. In order to make that more effective. Definitely as a designer, when you're first doing this for the first time, it takes a new way of thinking, some additional thinking that you're not used to. And like any skill, like the skill of climbing a mountain, you need to practice that skill in order to get good at it. And it's going to take you a lot longer to climb a particular rock face the first time than it will the 100th time, or even if that's the 100th rock face, even if you've never climbed it before. If you've done it 99 other climbs before, it's going to be a lot easier. And that the same thing goes for any skill, and design is a skill like that. But I think just talking about manual, because I think what you're also alluding to there is testing. Just like the Sisyphus picture that you're showing here, who was condemned to push the rock up to the top of the mountain, only to have it roll down and have to start all over again for all eternity. That's what a lot of organizations complain accessibility testing is like.
Yeah.
They say it's this manual thing. We wake up in the morning, go to work, do some testing, come back the next day, we got to do some testing, and it's the same testing we did the day before. And that's really not Agile. And that, just like Sisyphus, though, Jeff, that is in fact a myth that you cannot automate these things. And let me show you two different ways that you can automate.
Oh, cool.
So if you just advance the slide, I mean, obviously I'm a little bit biased.
I know. I bet there's a tool you're going to tell me about.
Yeah, because this is obviously Deque's accessibility testing library. It's open source and it's free. So from that point of view, I'm not being too partisan by asking you to use it. There are alternatives to it, and you can definitely find those if you do searches on the internet. But Axe is what we call a generic accessibility testing library or testing tool. And you can find about 50% of your accessibility problems by volume. In fact, just yesterday we were analyzing this website for this company, and Axe managed to find about 70% of the issues on that particular page. So the actual number can vary. Obviously, if you've got a very good development team who doesn't make a lot of accessibility problems, it's going to find fewer things. but over large studies of large numbers of web applications, we found about 50% is a good number. And
Yeah.
it serves as a kind of pre-baked test-driven development library. So if you're doing Agile development and you're developing a new piece of UI, the first thing you could do is embed the Axe library into your automated tests, and now you have some tests that have to pass. So before you can do anything, they have to pass the accessibility testing. So in terms of effort, it's really low effort. It's if you're using the interactive browser testing tool, it's click a button and it finds the problems for you and it tells you how to fix them directly there embedded into the application itself.
Cool.
But in terms of embedding into your automated tests, it's also very easy. And then that's there forever. Every time you run your regressions with those tests in it, it's going to test for the things that passed when you first wrote that. So, the Sisyphus type testing gets done by your automation framework, and it doesn't have to be a manual thing anymore at all.
Correct. Well, and the marketing speak of that is, hey, shift these tests left, put them in and stop inspecting the accessibility quality after the fact, build it in while you're developing where it's closer to where you're building things. Completely agree, and I bet you're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, just to show how easy it is. Here we have like a very simple JavaScript test to test some front-end UI.
Mm-hmm.
And all you need to do, if you have a particular set of functionality, you do your functional test. You pick up your fixture or wherever the UI has been rendered as part of that test, and you call the axe.run on that fixture, and it returns the results within milliseconds. It's super fast. We actually worked with Google because they embed this in their Lighthouse tool as well, and we're able to make it even faster. So it runs, in a lot of instances, it runs in milliseconds, and you can get your results and you can do assertions on those results. And obviously this is a great way to use this tool if you're writing new code from scratch. But a lot of our customers are starting with a legacy, and then instead of doing assertions like this to break the build, you can generate reports that you can use to build up a backlog of accessibility issues to fix as well.
Sure. I'm assuming this works with parallel testing and so forth as well.
It does work with parallel testing. You cannot run the library twice on the same page, though, the same fixture at the same time. But if you have your tests are running in parallel, then this runs in parallel too. If you have multiple browsers, if you have multiple, instances of your test library running, they can all run in parallel.
That's awesome. So this really helps to set things up. Then I can now look at accessibility in the same way I do everything else. I can do complete test-driven development and think about accessibility because I'll be writing those tests in. So then when I build my stuff, I'm building quality in.
Yeah, well, this, like I said, this gets you about 50% by volume. What the automation can't do, if you could just advance the slides. Well, okay, that's our mantra. I forgot about this slide. No code merges until Axe clean. So when we go through the streets of Washington D.C. protesting in favor of accessibility, we chant no code merges until Axe clean, and that's what we expect everybody to do, of course. But if you could just advance the next slide, Jeff.
We're going to talk about the other 50%.
Yeah, exactly. What is the 50% that we can't fully automate with a generic library like that? And it comes down once again to meaning. It's very easy for us to see if there's an accessibility alternative text for an image. It's currently still, with current technology, not possible for us to really tell whether the meaning of that text, if it is there, matches the user interface or the image or whatever it is that it's describing.
Sure.
And so, for example, I have an image here, and it would be pretty simple to say, okay, a woman in a headscarf standing in a crowd, but actually this is Ilan Omar, and the crowd that she's standing in is the people that she represents. And so that meaning is something that currently only a human can provide. And let me ask you a question, Jeff. Where does meaning come from in an application when you're designing user interface?
Well, that's, from the, that's what it's hard
from the
to
designer,
know.
right?
It's right from a designer who's trying to, get you to do a process. Yes.
Right. So it comes from the design intent that we talked about earlier. So if you just advance the slides, then you'll see. I think somewhere here I have another little design with some annotations that give us the meaning. So up in the top right of this wireframe, we have a little button, and inside the button is a little pencil icon. And that, if you look at the annotation at the top there, it says edit, and then in curly braces, recipe name. And so what the designer is telling us there is that this little widget here is designed to edit a recipe, and that button is the button that's going to pop up the edit dialog, and it should say edit and then refer to whatever the recipe name is. In this case, in this mock-up, it would be chocolate cake, but obviously if I've got my own recipes, each recipe is going to have a unique name. So what that button's name needs to mean is it needs to say edit the recipe, whatever recipe that is, whether it's mom's spaghetti or chocolate cake or brisket or whatever the recipe is. So now we can take that meaning and we can embed that into an automated test. So if you move to the next slide, you can see an example of where we actually utilize also the Axe library to help us with these things, because there are lots of different ways to apply an accessible text or an accessible name to a user interface widget in HTML, and all of that logic is embedded into the Axe library. So we just tell, so all we have to do in our test is we have to get the button. So we go and do a query using CSS to go and select that button. Then we go and do a query to fetch the heading, which contains the name of that recipe. Then we pass those two things into the Axe library to get the accessible text for the heading and the button. And then we say, okay, we expect the button text to be equal to edit space plus the content in the heading text, which is the title of that recipe. And so we can write an automated test like we write an automated test for any other requirement, taking the information straight out of the design that was communicated from the designer to the developer. So whoever's writing the tests, whether that is somebody in QA, whether that's another developer writing it in parallel with the developer who's writing the code, the functional code, or whether it's the same developer in a pair doing test-driven development, writing tests first and then writing code, the information comes straight out of the annotated designs, straight into the test, and will be there for all eternity. And because the logic about how a screen reader gets the text out of that HTML is embedded into the Axe core library, you can be sure that this will work, and the implementation can change. So if I decide one day I'm going to use ARIA label, the next day I'm going to use ARIA label by, or I'm going to use a title attribute, whatever I'm going to use to provide that accessible name, it doesn't matter to the test. The test will just work, and as long as the implementation is correct, the test will be robust in the face of change of the implementation. So pretty similar in concept to what you do, as you said, what you do with any other functional testing.
Well, and that's great, because at the end of the day, it'll make it gives you another way to verify that things are going to work, which is cool. When you start doing this, a little deeper embedded, the interactive testing and reading order, how do you automate those? Because
in the same way. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly the same way. And here you can see an example of an automated test where we're testing the keyboard interaction of an ARIA menu, making sure that the focus is managed correctly by that component as the user uses the keyboard to move left, right, up, down, open and close submenus, etc. So this is an example of that. I haven't got an example of the reading order, but the same concepts apply there. And then, as I said, also, Jeff, with both the Axe library and with any of these tests, you can generate, you can either fail things or you can generate reports on the health of your particular code base. And so the team will know, just by looking in Jenkins or Circle CI at the build status, they'll know whether or not it passed, whether the count of accessibility issues went up or down, and the overall accessibility of their application. So, that's a really great tool though for one set of for one team. I've heard, Jeff, that you are going to tell us about how you can utilize this and leverage this to look at metrics across multiple teams.
What a softball! What a softball! Well, that is exactly right. I think if you can't manage what you don't measure, and you need to actually pull more data. It's great that set of unit tests actually gets rolled in and don't merge things in, but wouldn't it be great if you were actually able to see this data across multiple products and across and across how does things work over time? Are we improving? Are we getting better? What percentage of the pipelines have accessibility built in versus we're ignoring those? What percentage of pipelines are actually passing? How many pages do we have per team? What are the trends that are happening, and what areas would I focus on? If I'm in charge of managing application delivery, I'm really kind of looking for the exceptions, those areas I can focus on. And again, I'm here at Plutora. That's part of what we do. We take and incorporate a lot of the analytics of these application delivery pipelines and make them available in a standardized fashion so that you can expose that out to teams, to upper management, as well as to product owners and delivery managers to make sure we're headed in the right direction. Whatever our goals are, you can use these tools to do just that. And these tools are important. I can't emphasize enough the value of measurement. In my role as a marketing guy, I see people ask for money for tools all the time. And what's funny is if where the money is coming from isn't used to seeing the results of, hey, we're going to invest X amount of money and time into a particular tool, and yet we don't show the result of that, we can then expect to, well, the next time we ask for something, it's not going to go so well. Ultimately, we want to do better than we've done before, so get used to producing some results. From an accessibility point of view, as you look at the results here, it'd be pretty easy to just look at this over time and say, hey, I can see where the problems are. I can see which lines of business I can go get and focus in and zoom in on to help improve those processes. Because
so Jeff, I recognize some of these things here from the data that we generate with our test reporting. So the score on the top left there is the accessibility score that we generate. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and then those lines just to the right of that are showing different pipelines or different applications, and together the aggregate score of those is 93. But you can actually see the score of each of those pipelines changing over time.
Correct. And in fact, then I'm using this from an analytics point of view. You can combine pipelines into lines of businesses. You can single in on an application. You can look at the page trendings. The whole point is with this, you kind of have to follow your nose where the problems are, and where you see interesting trends, you can drill in and then take action on that. Anyways,
that's good.
So, there's another aspect of this as well, which is a governance point of view. We never did really ask the question, what happens if, have there been cases where things don't work out well for a company because they neglected accessibility? And if so, boy, a really good tip here is to incorporate accessibility tests as part of your release orchestration from a governance point of view. There's a lot of tools out there that are helping with release orchestration. It's not pipeline orchestration per se, but it's everything that happens after the artifact's built and making sure that the right things were built into the pipeline to begin with. Make sure that tests are there, making sure there's no sub ones. And again, Plutora, we've got a tool here to help you in that process that will help with that governance and measurement across all the pipelines. Looking at what the test progress is, what the level of release activities are, and really where that ends up. And highly recommend, if you're not using some kind of tool here to oversee and manage the application delivery, both from a governance point of view as well as from a best practices point of view, you're missing out. There's a lot that can be done here that will help provide transparency and visibility into your pipelines themselves and ultimately govern them. And you can take activities like accessibility and make sure, hey, I can tell you which pipelines are kind of an accessibility risk because I don't see any other stuff in what I see in my release trains. So now, one of the things I really love, Dylan, is that, well, you kind of wrote the book on accessibility, didn't you?
I did, but I would like to know, Jeff, do we have another poll? I'd like to know where organizations are in terms of their pipelines. Can we put that second poll up?
Oh, that's right. I totally forgot. Thank you.
I wasn't sure. I was waiting for it, but then you moved on, so I wasn't sure. But here's your poll now. And someone asked earlier if we could read out the options out loud. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And the poll says, select all of the activities that are important to start your accessibility testing journey. And select one or more of the following. Creating an accessibility score for all applications. Begin adding accessibility design reviews into the process. Begin adding accessibility unit tests. Begin adding accessibility testing during the testing phase. And then lastly, adding a deployment gates to ensure accessibility testing.
We're just collecting responses. If most folks are just thinking and doing it, really curious about where folks sit on what you need. You know, are you what's most important to you as you start thinking about this, and what aspects do you want to get, you know, working on? We'll keep going for just a few more seconds, and then
I'll go ahead and show the results.
And you can push those to the screen, right?
Yes, I can. So every attendee should be able to see it. Okay.
And this is not a select one, just select all that's interesting?
Yes. Are you able to see these results?
I am.
Yeah.
I think I'll go to webinars hiding it for me, but yes. Everybody wants to start building accessibility unit tests and doing accessibility testing after it's there. And then, boy, we need to start scoring our applications and making sure we incorporate design reviews. So it seems like all of these things are important. And we've talked about tools here to help you on your journey. But I do like the fact that, well, let's see, are we ready to come back to, can you see my screen again?
Yes, we can.
Sweet. So I was kind of teasing here that Dylan, you wrote the book on accessibility in Agile.
Yeah. Just if people are interested, we talked about 4 different practices today that you can use to get quick traction. I talked about there's another 12 for a total of 16 in the book. It's free if you get it on Kindle Unlimited. And there's various different ways to get it. So if you're interested in this, in understanding those practices and what other ones you can implement, I definitely recommend it. I'm biased, of course.
I love it. Well, and I remember when we first talked about it, I was so fascinated with this as a standardized practice that could be automated. Boy, it's just, I think everyone is saying, according to the polls, like, yeah, let's begin adding some of these accessibility unit tests and let's see how we're doing. And I think that's exactly right. And start measuring the progress that we've got. So it's good. It's really good. Thank you for that. I think this is the part where we tell you a little bit about ourselves and what we do. And I think I'll kick that off by talking about value stream management. And you'll wonder, what does value stream management have to do with any of this? That seems like a foreign marketing term. It's really not. We at Plutora have a value stream management platform, the way of managing value streams in the application delivery process from ideation all the way to production. It includes 3 basic layers of we integrate into the entirety of the tool chain, including tools like Deque and pull that data in and normalize it into a common data model, converging the tool chain so that defects that are created in one place are seen in other places, so we can relate the build information back with the initiatives, epics. We can correlate them across to teams and so forth. We then have a management orchestration layer, which allows you to do things like pipeline management, release orchestration, looking across the different pipelines that are included, so that you can then say, hey, I might decide as an oversight that I don't want to release any more pipelines unless they're accessibility have started adding some level of accessibility, and I'll set some target goals for the their accessibility score that they're going to go through, and I don't want to release unless they're hitting that level. You can set some kind of governance even in an autonomous agile DevOps kind of team, or if you're still dealing with legacy teams, you can do that as well. The whole point is this is agnostic of development methodology. What's really cool then is all that rolls up into a decision-making analytics layer. We've got a partnership with Tableau, as well as other kinds of tools that we integrate that allow you to have complete pipeline oversight and deep analytics and comparative metrics. We incorporate some machine learning type behaviors so that you can look at trending and predictions of what's coming in the future. All of this is what's called value stream management. If you haven't heard of it, take a look, because Forrester's got a wave on it. It's a new category of tools. There's a lot more people coming in this space. And it's you expect a new wave out sometime in 2020 that will define it even further, but it's a very cool thing. And if you're really interested, I'm happy to get folks connected with the folks at Forrester, and we can have deeper conversations. Always interested in keeping the conversation going. And Dylan, you were going to tell us a bit more about the DQ tools, and I see that my slide for that has gone away. I wanted to make sure we talked about the DQ tools because they're really cool. I know we talked about some of them. Do you want to give us a quick shout out before we jump to the questions?
Yeah, so DQ is both a tool and services company. We help with all the way from training, tools for developers, for shifting as far left as possible in the process, tools that help the QA organizational QA role to test for accessibility, as well as tools for compliance and governance to monitor that. Jeff talked about the ways that the dev tools can be integrated into things like Plutora, Jenkins, Circle CI, etc. So we've designed our tools to fit really well within the developer workflow, both DevOps, DevSecOps, as well as the interactive debugging workflow as well. And we also have tools that can help for fixing applications that are already in deployment, and online training that you can take and become certified in accessibility, how to test, how to develop, etc.
Awesome.
With that, Jeff, over to questions.
Yeah, there's a few, and if you have questions, put them in that questions panel, and we'll get to them. We got a number of questions already that we can dig in with and walk through. But first one, what tools should I train my developers on just to get them started right now? If I have to hand them a tool, I'm going to add my own words to that. If I have to hand them a tool, what tool from DQ should I start with?
Well, I think the easiest tool to start with is the Axe set of tools, where the easy button, we call it. And so Axe and Axe Pro are definitely the places to start. It's as easy as pressing a button, and it embeds all the information that you need to start learning how to fix those issues, helps you fix them. We have enterprise versions of those tools as well. So if you're more interested in behind the firewall type stuff, then we can provide tools that's called Worldspace Attest. It's a great place. Those are both great places to start if you're looking for ways to get kickstarted.
And I'm assuming people can just give you a ring as well and say, hey, help get us set up, and you'll get them started on that. Yeah,
absolutely. We have Axe is self-serve in that sense. You can just go to our website, and there's links to where you can get started, and there's also links on our website if you're interested in enterprise level tools.
Awesome. There's a question about training. What kinds of training options do you have, and what do you suggest for training?
Well, we have a lot of training options. We have self-service Deque University. You go to dequeuniversity.com and you can sign up for individual courses, which are very cheap. I think they're cheap, not only affordable. And all the way to, we do on-site in-person training, multi-day in-person training, and everything in between. If it really, when you say get started, it really means, it depends on what you mean by that. If it's just an individual, I would start with the online courses. Take for example, web accessibility curriculum, which will give you everything you need to know how to develop accessible software and test accessible software, the software for accessibility. It's a great place to start. If you're an organization and you have a lot of people to train, you might want to start with some in-person training, structured training. And we can help you with figuring that out if you have a more complex case.
Cool. There's a question about what are some of the downsides of not making our internal software accessibility enabled? I'm imagining you've got some war stories. My commentary on that question.
Yeah, there's various different ways that can bite you. Some of the more, if you talk about it from an opportunity perspective, somewhere between 20 and 25% of people, adults in the US, have some form of disability. So in a world, e-commerce world, where fractions of percentages can make a huge difference to your bottom line, if you're not providing as good an experience to that large segment of the market as your competitors are, you're potentially losing out on spending power that's quite substantial. We've done some studies on this. Vector Research has done a study on the spending power of these sorts of groups, and it's really significant. And that's on the other side of the spectrum, organizations that can get into some serious trouble with regards to this. It can damage your brand. A lot of you will be familiar with the Domino's case and what has happened with that. Mm-hmm. They've spent a lot of money fighting this court case, and at the end of the day, they're probably just going to have to fix the stuff anyway. So they've just right. damaged their brand and wasted a bunch of money just to find out that they have to do it anyway. So it's a lot cheaper to do this at your own pace rather than at the pace dictated by some kind of consent decree. Yep. And so if you get ahead of the problem, it's not only cheaper, but you get to decide the pace at which you do it, and you get the benefits that I just talked about as well. So all around, from a financial perspective, it really makes sense to get ahead of the curve here.
Awesome. There's a question about what would I need to do to create an accessibility score for all of my products?
Well, the first thing you need is a couple of products that are going to measure that.
I love that question.
We can help you with that. And then you need to decide what are you going to do with the metrics. Having metrics that aren't going to change your behavior are somewhat meaningless. So you got to decide, well, what's a meaningful score to us? And we have some out of the box options here that we can help you with. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what do you want to do with that score, and so that we can actually make sure you're getting a metric that gives you what you need in order to help your organization change. So if you're interested in things like how much adoption are you getting, how much are your developers changing, then some of the metrics that Jeff showed you and some of the tools that Jeff showed you are really good tools, because they can show you across multiple teams how much activity is there, how much of the developers are actually changing, and you can measure things before they make it to production, which is also leading indicators rather than lagging indicators. So at the end of the day, we have between Plutora and Deque, we have lots of options to help you with that. But what you really need to think about is what you want to get from that measurement. Gotcha.
There's a question that I'll add to, but it says, what do I what do I need to get in order to make my management smarter on accessibility? And probably the way I would ask that too is, how do I build the business case for investing more in accessibility?
The vector research study that I talked about is obviously very important, can give you some great business return on investment arguments to make. We also have seen great success from bringing people with disabilities in to do demonstrations of using your software with a screen reader.
Wow. That's eye-opening, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we do what we call empathy labs, where we do that on a larger scale. We don't only have one person, we have a bunch of different ways that we can teach people in the organization at the exec level all the way down about really what do we mean when we talk about accessibility, the different types of disabilities and how those affect the way that people interact with applications and consume information. And so there are a lot of options there, all the way from, Gorilla, bring in some people with disabilities, all the way to programs that you can run to kind of do this more systematically throughout your organization.
Very cool. There's a comment, not all accessibility bugs are created equal. Can you provide some tips to prioritize the accessibility bugs? I'm assuming they're already using tools like DQ, and it's created some bugs. What guidance do you have for that?
Well, first of all, this is one of the big areas where, getting ahead of the curve and not reacting to some kind of lawsuit is going to help. Because if you're reacting to a consent decree, then you're going to be stuck with whatever the consent decree says. And you might not have as many options as you have if you get ahead of the curve. If you get ahead of the curve, then really any accessibility defect is just a defect like any other defect. And we have ways of measuring, of helping you to map those to your standard defect category. So you probably already within your organization have CF1 defects, and you have a classification for that, and CF2 and CF3, etc. And we can just help you map those to those severities. The tools that we have some defaults built into them, but those defaults are really kind of worst case scenarios. In a worst case scenario, how impactful could this sort of issue be? In reality, you're going to want to look at each of those instances and say, okay, this image, for example, doesn't have an alt attribute, but it's in the footer and it's really peripheral to what's going on this page, so therefore it's not that impactful. Whereas if it happens to be the alt attribute for an image button that you cannot, that you need in order to complete a workflow, you're going to want to treat that almost like a CF1. So it's really about having a way of mapping those defects to the impact and to your standard defect severities, and being able to manage them as equal defects and quality defects like any others.
Awesome. I think we're out of time. I will just say, if anybody has anything else following up, get a hold of Dylan, get a hold of myself, reach out from LinkedIn or email or however, and we'll happily help that out. And we'll turn it back over to DZone.
Yeah, thank you. With that, I would like to thank Dylan and Jeff for a phenomenal presentation. I would also like to thank Plutora for providing the audience with a great webinar. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dylan.
Thank you.